Ladies and gentlemen, seekers of truth, when we ask who is the biggest enemy of humanity, our instinct is to look outward. We point to tyrants, to ideologies, to war, greed, and disease. But to ask the right question is to walk toward the truth, and the truth does not lie outside. It lies within. The greatest enemy of humanity is not a nation, not a weapon, not a force of nature. It is the unexamined self. There is a darkness that dwells in every soul, a hidden twin to the light we like to show the world. It is the part of ourselves we deny, suppress, and exile. This is what I would call the shadow, and it is the most dangerous thing in existence when left unchecked. You see, when a person refuses to confront their own darkness, that darkness does not vanish. It festers, it grows, and eventually it seeks expression, not through conscious will but through projection. We blame others for what lives in ourselves. We demonize what we do not understand in our own hearts. And what begins as inner conflict becomes collective catastrophe. History is a chronicle not just of events, but of human unconsciousness, genocide, war, slavery, all born from our refusal to take responsibility for our inner life. The tyrants of the world are not isolated aberrations, they are the mirror of what lives in the depths of the many. Evil is not always loud. It often whispers. It lives in passive complicity, in the choice to look away, in the fear of seeing our own reflection. We create monsters not because we are evil by nature, but because we are too afraid to face the complexity of our own psyche. So, who is the enemy? It is not them. It is the unseen part of me and you when we refuse to know it. But there is hope. To confront our inner darkness is the most terrifying and yet most necessary journey. It is not a battle of destruction but a reconciliation. When we make the unconscious conscious, we reclaim our wholeness, and only whole people build whole societies. So let us stop asking, who is the enemy out there, and start asking, what within me remains unlived, unseen, and unknown? For in that question lies our redemption. The enemy of humanity is not external, but internal. When we look at the history of our species, it is tempting to blame the catastrophes of humanity on external forces, warlords, corrupt governments, foreign enemies, or unpredictable events of nature. It is far easier and far more comfortable to believe that the source of our suffering lies outside of us. But this is a psychological illusion, one born from fear and projection. The greatest threat to humanity is not something outside of us, it is within us. The enemy of humanity is internal. It is the part of the human psyche that resists self-examination. At the root of every war, every act of cruelty, every failure of empathy, lies the unacknowledged inner world of individuals. We each carry within us a realm that is often hidden even from ourselves, a shadow composed of repressed desires, unlived emotions, and denied truths. This shadow is not evil in and of itself, but when left unacknowledged, it festers in the dark corners of the soul. Over time, this unexamined part of ourselves seeks expression, and it often does so in destructive ways. We see this in how people project their own fears onto others. Rather than confronting their internal insecurities, individuals find scapegoats. They blame outsiders, those who are different, those who challenge their worldview. Groups do the same. Entire societies have turned their shadows outward, creating enemies from those who merely reflect what they have refused to confront within. The wars of the world are mirrors of the wars within. The internal enemy takes many forms. Sometimes it is pride that prevents growth. Sometimes it is fear masquerading as hatred. Often it is the simple but dangerous refusal to ask difficult questions. Who am I, really? What do I fear? What am I avoiding? The human tendency to run from these questions leads to apathy, conformity, and blind obedience, the conditions in which cruelty thrives. Even the most monstrous acts in history have not been carried out by inherently evil individuals, but by ordinary people who became possessed by ideas, ideologies, and commands that resonated with something unconscious within them. When people stop thinking for themselves, when they are unwilling to confront their own moral responsibility, they become tools of a much darker force, the collective shadow. The internal enemy is not merely personal, but collective. When large groups of people deny their inner conflicts, those unresolved energies leak into politics, religion, culture, and technology. The results can be catastrophic. Systems built on fear, societies ruled by control, and innovations used to destroy rather than heal. But this truth is not hopeless. In fact, it is liberating, because if the enemy is within, then so is the solution. By turning our gaze inward, by recognizing our own contradictions, fears, and flaws, we reclaim our power. To confront the inner world is not weakness, it is the highest form of courage. It paves the path toward wholeness. Humanity will not be saved by conquering enemies, but by integrating its shadows. Peace will not come through domination, but through self-awareness. The work begins not in distant lands or in the halls of power, but in the quiet honesty of our own hearts. So long as we continue to look for the enemy out there, we will never find peace. But when we learn to face what is in here, in the depths of the human soul, we take the first step toward healing the world. The shadow within each person, if left unacknowledged, becomes collective destruction. Deep within every human being lies a hidden realm, not always dark, but certainly unexplored. It is a part of the psyche made up of all the things we choose not to see in ourselves. Our suppressed desires, rejected instincts, unowned emotions, and unspoken fears. This is what psychologists often refer to as the shadow. Not because it is evil, but because it is hidden. And what is hidden tends to become dangerous, not by its nature, but by the consequences of neglect. When a person refuses to acknowledge their shadow, it doesn't disappear, it becomes distorted. The traits we deny in ourselves do not vanish, they become projected outward onto others. A person who cannot face their own aggression may begin to see the world as hostile. Someone who represses their own envy may resent others' success. A person who cannot admit their own capacity for manipulation may constantly suspect others of deceit. The unconscious does not remain quiet. It speaks through projection, dreams, fears, and eventually action. Now imagine this happening not just in one person, but across millions. When entire populations neglect their inner world, the shadow does not simply stay personal. It becomes collective. A society that fears its own instincts builds systems of rigid control. A culture that cannot face its own guilt invents enemies to punish. A nation that represses vulnerability glorifies violence as strength. The personal shadow becomes a societal one, and when left unexamined, it leads to collective destruction. We see the effects throughout history. Genocides, wars, fanaticism. These are not random outbreaks of evil. They are eruptions of the collective shadow, manifesting in leaders and movements that give people permission to act out what they have repressed. The cruelty we witness in the world is often the result of what we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. It is important to understand that the shadow is not bad, it is merely unknown. It contains everything that has been cast out of the light of conscious awareness. Not just hatred or fear, but also potential, creativity, and truth. What makes the shadow dangerous is not its content, but our refusal to look at it. Like an ignored wound, it festers. Like an unguarded flame, it burns everything around it. The moment we deny our inner darkness, we give it power. We become vulnerable to manipulation, to ideology, to the kinds of mass movements that demand blind obedience. A person disconnected from their own depths is easily swept away by the collective, because they do not recognize how the collective mirrors their own shadow. To prevent this, we must take responsibility for our inner world. The task is not easy. It requires humility, courage, and brutal honesty. It means seeing ourselves not as heroes or victims, but as complex beings capable of both creation and destruction. It means recognizing that the seeds of war, hatred, and oppression do not only live in history books, they also live in our unconscious mind. But there is hope. The same energy that fuels destruction can also fuel transformation. When we bring the shadow into the light, it ceases to control us. It becomes integrated. We become more whole. And whole individuals create healthier societies. The future of humanity depends not on external conquest but on inner reconciliation. If we are to avoid repeating the tragedies of our past, we must begin with the individual soul. Each of us must face the darkness we carry, not to destroy it, but to understand it, to reclaim it, and to transform it. Only then can we interrupt the cycle of collective destruction and begin to shape a world not built on fear, but on the full truth of what it means to be human. Evil thrives in unconsciousness and moral laziness. Evil rarely enters the world with horns and a dramatic fanfare. It does not always appear as a monstrous figure announcing its intentions. More often, it creeps in quietly, not through the hands of the openly malevolent, but through the minds of those who have ceased to think, ceased to question, and ceased to care. Evil thrives in unconsciousness and moral laziness. What is unconsciousness in this context? It is the condition in which a person moves through life asleep to their inner world, unaware of their motives, their emotions, their fears, and their impact on others. It is a kind of psychological blindness, not of intellect but of soul. A person may be brilliant, successful, or even well-liked, and yet entirely unconscious of the forces that drive them. Without self-awareness, without reflection, they become highly susceptible to external influence, and this is precisely where evil finds fertile ground. The unconscious person is vulnerable, not only to being manipulated by others, but to becoming an agent of harm themselves. They adopt ideologies without examination, participate in systems without questioning their morality, and follow orders without reflecting on consequences. History is full of people who were just doing their jobs, even when their jobs involved cruelty, exclusion, or destruction. These were not always monstrous people, they were often ordinary, but asleep. Now, consider moral laziness. This is not the absence of values, but the refusal to live them out consciously. It is the tendency to avoid the discomfort of ethical reflection. It is the habit of choosing convenience over principle, silence over courage, and comfort over confrontation. Moral laziness often hides behind slogans, traditions, or social norms. It says, "That's just the way things are," or "It's not my responsibility." And in doing so, it allows systems of injustice to flourish. The danger is not that people do not know what is right. It is that they stop caring enough to act on it. It is far easier to remain neutral, to blend in, to avoid the burden of moral responsibility. But this ease is precisely the opening through which evil spreads. In fact, much of the world's worst atrocities have not required millions of evil people. Only millions of morally lazy ones who stood by and said nothing. Unconsciousness and moral laziness are twin forces. One blinds us to the reality of our own behavior. The other numbs our will to do anything about it. Together, they create the conditions where manipulation becomes easy, cruelty becomes normalized, and lies become. They allow leaders to rise unchecked, ideologies to spread unchallenged, and injustice to root itself deeply in daily life. The antidote is not perfection, but awareness. To become conscious is to begin seeing ourselves and the world clearly, to notice where we act out of fear, habit, or imitation. To resist moral laziness is to take the harder path, to ask questions, to examine our assumptions, and to take ethical stands, even when it costs us something. This is not easy work. It requires ongoing effort. But it is the only way to remain truly human in a world that often rewards unconsciousness. Each time we choose to look away, we contribute, passively, to the spread of harm. Each time we choose to reflect, to care, to act with integrity, we interrupt that spread. Evil does not need our active support to thrive, it only needs our indifference. So if we wish to protect what is good, we must stay awake, we must think, we must feel, and most of all, we must refuse to surrender our moral will, even when it is easier, safer, or more popular to remain asleep. Projection of inner conflict onto others creates division and war. One of the most destructive psychological mechanisms in the human psyche is projection. The act of attributing to others what we cannot or will not face within ourselves. When we are unable to confront our own fears, shame, aggression, or desires, we cast them onto the world around us. This process may begin within individuals, but when magnified across communities, cultures, or nations, it becomes the silent engine of division and war. Projection happens unconsciously. A person who carries suppressed anger might begin to perceive others as threatening or hostile. Someone who fears their own vulnerability might judge others as weak or pathetic. An individual who has not reconciled with their inner chaos may obsess over controlling their environment. The mind, unwilling to accept certain truths about the self, seeks relief by assigning those qualities to someone else. In doing so, it creates an illusion of separation. I am good, they are bad. I am innocent, they are guilty. This binary thinking becomes the foundation of us versus them. It is deeply appealing because it simplifies the world. Instead of wrestling with uncomfortable truths about oneself, the individual feels justified, even righteous, in their dislike or fear of the other. But this illusion is dangerous. It divides not only individuals but entire groups. It becomes the root of prejudice, racism, xenophobia, and religious intolerance. When inner conflict is denied by enough individuals within a society, it manifests collectively. Nations begin to project their own internal weaknesses onto other nations. A society struggling with corruption may accuse others of moral decay. A country fearful of its own instability may paint other cultures as chaotic and dangerous. Leaders, aware of the power of projection, often exploit it, turning internal dissatisfaction outward to galvanize their people through fear and hatred. Wars, both literal and ideological, are often fueled by projection. They are not born solely from rational interests like land, resources, or power. More often, they arise from inflamed emotions, ancient wounds, and unresolved historical traumas. These emotional undercurrents are stirred and directed outward. They are the threat. They must be stopped. And suddenly, what began as an internal conflict becomes a global crisis. The tragedy of projection is that it creates mirrors, not enemies. What we attack in others often reflects something unacknowledged in ourselves. But rather than seeing these reflections as opportunities for growth, we react with fear and aggression. We miss the chance to integrate what is disowned and instead escalate the conflict. The only path out of this cycle is self-awareness. When individuals begin to recognize their projections, when they start to ask, why does this person provoke such a strong reaction in me? What part of myself have I hidden here? They reclaim responsibility for their emotional world. This process doesn't just lead to personal growth. It is also the foundation of peace. Imagine a society where people are taught to turn inward before reacting outward, where leaders are expected to reflect, not inflame, where cultural differences are approached with curiosity rather than fear. Such a world would not be free from conflict, but it would be free from the kind of blind division that leads to violence. The road to that world begins with the individual. We must each learn to hold the mirror and ask, what part of me have I been projecting onto you? In that question lies both humility and power. So long as we deny our own inner contradictions, we will continue to fight them in others. But when we integrate what we've disowned, the enemy outside begins to dissolve. Peace, then, is not merely the absence of war, it is the presence of inner clarity. The refusal to confront oneself leads to hatred, fear, and tyranny. There is a silent war waged every day, not between nations or ideologies, but within the heart of every human being. It is the war between who we are and what we are unwilling to see in ourselves. The refusal to confront oneself, to examine one's thoughts, emotions, fears, and motivations, is not a passive act. It has consequences. It creates the psychological conditions in which hatred, fear, and tyranny are born and sustained. At first glance, self-confrontation may seem like a private matter, a moral or emotional task relevant only to the individual. But this is a dangerous misunderstanding. When enough individuals neglect the inner work of self-awareness, the result is not merely personal dysfunction, it is societal decay. A person who refuses to look inward begins to seek meaning, power, and identity outwardly. Instead of asking, why do I feel this way? Or what in me is unresolved? The unconscious mind projects its confusion and pain onto the external world. Fear is not recognized as internal anxiety. It becomes proof that the world is dangerous. Anger is not explored as a signal from within. It becomes blame toward others. Shame, guilt, insecurity, all of it gets displaced onto scapegoats. This psychological avoidance creates hatred, not because the individual is inherently hateful, but because they have not dealt with the root of their pain. Hatred becomes a defense mechanism, a way to push away that which threatens the fragile, unexamined identity. And because it offers the illusion of strength, it is seductive. It tells people, you are not the problem, they are. From hatred arises fear, of change, of difference, of the unknown. When a person has not built a solid foundation of inner clarity, the unfamiliar becomes terrifying. They seek security not from within, but from rigid belief systems, simplistic ideologies, and the comfort of conformity. Fearful people are easily manipulated because they are desperate to avoid discomfort, to silence doubt, to escape the responsibility of thinking for themselves. And in the hands of the wrong leaders, this fear becomes a tool. Tyranny does not begin with guns and chains. It begins with unexamined minds. It begins when people prefer certainty over truth, obedience over reflection, and control over freedom. Tyrants do not create fear, they exploit it. They offer clarity in exchange for complexity, identity in exchange for introspection, and order in exchange for truth. And in doing so, they gain immense power over those who refuse to confront themselves. History offers us countless examples of this pattern. Authoritarian regimes rising in moments of cultural anxiety, Violence justified by simplistic narratives. Populations turning against their neighbors not because of logic or justice, but because of unresolved psychological tensions. Every tyranny begins in the shadow, the part of the self that was disowned, denied, and left to rot. And yet, this is not a hopeless truth. If the cause of hatred, fear, and tyranny is internal refusal, then the antidote is internal courage. The willingness to confront oneself, honestly, painfully, and continually, is not just personal growth. It is an act of resistance against everything that threatens human dignity. It means asking hard questions. It means sitting with discomfort. It means accepting that we are capable of both beauty and brutality, and that only by acknowledging the latter can we truly choose the former. No society can be free where individuals are enslaved by their own unexamined psyche. No peace is possible when people are ruled by fear they do not understand. And no justice can last where truth is buried beneath avoidance. To confront oneself is the beginning of all liberation. Only by making the unconscious conscious can we overcome our truest enemy. There is a realm within each of us that we do not fully know, a realm that speaks in dreams, impulses, symbols, and emotional reactions. It holds our forgotten memories, suppressed emotions, rejected traits, and unspoken desires. This is the unconscious, and it is not passive. It moves, it influences, it shapes our choices, often without us ever realizing it. Until we bring the unconscious into consciousness, we are not truly free. We are led by hidden forces, ruled by what we refuse to face, and therein lies the root of our deepest personal and collective suffering. The unconscious is not evil. It is not the enemy, but when it is ignored, it becomes the breeding ground for the enemy within. Left in the dark, it controls us in subtle ways, through irrational fears, repeated patterns, and the projection of our unwanted inner contents onto others. We find ourselves trapped in cycles, hurting those we love, sabotaging what we desire, fearing what we don't understand, and then, looking outward, we wonder why the world is in such turmoil. But the chaos without is always a reflection of the chaos within. The wars between nations are magnified versions of the wars within hearts, between love and resentment, peace and pride, truth and comfort. We cannot create peace in the world if we remain strangers to ourselves. Our truest enemy is not outside us, it is the part of ourselves we have refused to know. To bring the unconscious into consciousness is not simply about insight, it is about integration. It means recognizing the shadow and learning to work with it, not against it. It means taking responsibility for our reactions instead of blaming others. It means acknowledging that the line between good and evil does not run between nations or ideologies, but straight through the human soul, including our own. This is not easy work. It requires a level of self-honesty that can feel threatening. To look inward is to risk discovering parts of ourselves that contradict the image we have built, the mask we wear to feel acceptable, righteous, or strong. But this risk is necessary, because as long as we remain unconscious, we are not whole. And we are not free. The unconscious holds not only our darkness, but also our potential. Buried in it are forgotten dreams, undeveloped talents, and the wisdom of the deeper self. To make the unconscious conscious is to reclaim this power, to become more fully alive, more fully human. It is the process of individuation, the path toward becoming the person we were always meant to be. Societies, too, have an unconscious. Cultures suppress inconvenient histories, blind themselves to systemic truths, and repeat cycles of violence because they have not done the inner work. Healing the world, therefore, is not just a political or economic task. It is a psychological revolution, beginning at the level of the individual soul. We must each become willing to turn inward, not with judgment, but with curiosity, to observe our reactions, listen to our dreams, question our certainties, to ask, what am I not seeing? What part of me am I avoiding? What truth have I buried that now governs me in silence? In the end, this is the only real victory available to us. Not the conquest of enemies, not the silencing of dissent, not the accumulation of power, but the transformation of unconsciousness into awareness. For in awareness there is freedom, in freedom there is choice, and in that choice lies the possibility of a life and a world no longer ruled by fear, but by truth.